Welcome everyone to the Sovereign Stack. My name is Braden. Today we are interviewing Mark Wilcox of 2018. I am joined by Dashus, my co-host. I think everyone will enjoy this episode very much. So without further ado, here we are.
Hey Mark,
Yeah.
how you doing?
How's it going? Good.
I'm jealous of you living in New Zealand right now because it's very cold here. How's 2018?
So it's interesting. I started the company like 4 years ago, pretty much 4.5 years ago at this point. And we had first 2 years of the company was sort of like twiddling our thumbs, waiting to be able to hop on a plane again. And then we had a sort of crazy 2 years after that. So it's all sort of like we actually sort of put things in hibernation to kind of prepare to figure out how to like address a bunch of like challenges and issues. But the thing is that we were operating on a very fast paced and short time frame, and the ideas that we've been working on and a lot of the progress that we'd made in the last 18 months, plus changes that were happening in the market, sort of meant that a lot of early momentum that we had built up really we just needed to calm it down and then assess the situation and then look at, hey, what's the easiest way to get some of this stuff into people's hands. So we had a quite considerable team up until November last year. But it wasn't my intent really to kind of get to a 4-year-old company and not have a product to market and not be making revenue and have a large team on the table. It's interesting. We made a bunch of strategic decisions early on in the business about how we actually use the technology and the architecture we've been developing. So in some situations that had given us quite a cognitive challenge, because rather than just kind of using all of the off-the-shelf tools that everybody uses to make software companies, and you could like maybe compare Tlon as an example in this case, where they ended up having their technology kind of drift because their product and short-term business objectives and things like this and Ethereum and these other technologies coming into the fold, that sort of compromised a little bit of the clean slate vision. So I had already seen that when I was starting the company, and we made a choice early on that we basically had to be as independent as possible. We still had some technologies, and so there were some challenges with like really getting to a fully like self-hosting system. We did get to that in sort of concept and architecturally. We didn't manage to get like our full thing because you had to kind of like rebuild everything 12 times. But we had an interesting set of advantages, and I think a lot of that kind of maybe like you could tell something different about what we were doing, especially when we started to get a lot of attention last year. And so we were, even though we were, on paper, it's a scary way to run a company. Our capacity to actually do a lot of that stuff is because of parts of what we had done early on and how we had chosen to build the company could enable us to stomach a lot of risk. And so when you think about any normal technology, any organization really, you really want to grow as quickly as possible in that first year and 18 months. You need to get all your product nailed. You need to get all your team built. You need to get you're on a growth chart, because once you're on that trajectory, then it goes up until it blows up basically. And most software company, most startups that do anything high complexity technology development that's new and that's different and that needs to be proven and so on, what happens is that once you hit that 30-person mark, you have communication breakdown. And this technology is the opposite. Under 30 people, it's really, really hard to figure out. And it's like AI. It kind of only works at scale. It's like if you have a telephone or like a blockchain, right? If you only have like 30 people running the network, it's not going to be very fault tolerant, and it's not going to have any utility for one person. This is like a hybrid of AI and blockchain. or Bitcoin really is like blockchain is a bit too like liberal about what it really means. This is a like hybrid architecture of like proof of work Bitcoin, and which includes the Bitcoin chain itself and artificial intelligence. It's updating that architecture. And sort of like my ability to be that clear on it is maybe because we got to the end of our like research full upstart like research phase, and who we are and what we do and how we understand it is quite different from when I was starting it. When we were starting, it was still sort of like NFTs were new to people, and we definitely went through that phase. But we learned a lot more, like once we kind of got the business up and running, about what types of problems that we can actually solve. And so there was sort of like two phases. There was sort of like the first 2 years, which was like COVID lockdown, high, like, crazy interest rates, like monkey pictures and pandemics and everything. And then there was the following 2 years, which was all AI. Wave, and both of those things actually were one was very extreme in high and low rates, and one has been very extreme in high rates. And what is sort of happening now is that those sort of cancelled it out, and we're returning to a little bit of the norm. Whereas we had a lot of crazy shit going down in the world in the last 2 years, and it's a little bit like those two waves of extremism. One would be on one side, which would be like COVID pandemic, crazy lockdown stuff from the West, and then in the from 2022, it's like Putin type of stuff on the other side. And a lot of that extreme online like psychology is now more neutral, and what that has. I got put in the first 2 years of the company in a very isolated space. And then, especially last year, we were kind of thrust into the open. And we kind of, on one side, we were holding off a bunch of people. And on the other side, we were holding off a bunch of people too. So what's interesting, though, is that we have also learned a lot. And the market is much more established when you think about proof of work and AI. But it's still very early. Like people don't really kind of know how either of those are going to work. There's lots of open problems and challenges. So I wanted to make this point about the communication complexity in an organization. In the first sort of 12 to 18 months of the business, I knew very well that it was important that we got to a large team as quickly and cheaply as possible. And that was working very well. We kind of had this early team. We're very cost efficient in times when people were raising crazy money. We were very focused. We had everybody in person and so forth. And we were building all of our early versions of the products. Those were done in a very sort of like that was almost like pure research, because we were learning from the work. So we would build something and then make some progress, have this experience, and then have some realization that then would backport to the architecture. So we sort of did this project very speculatively, very backwards from what people would normally do with when they rationally approach design and engineering, which is you have some hard definition of some problem, and you try to propose a rational solution to that definition of what that problem is. And what the market that we're in is what's called speculative design. So the types of problems that need to be solved out there in the world are not problems that are easily defined. They are problems that seem to be computationally difficult, that seem to escape you. And when people try to rationally come up with solutions to problems that they're facing, they're actually making the problem worse and worse and worse. And it's like inflation. And you need to start from first principles, this is how a proper actual like strong, rigid, secure foundation system architecture works. And this is like a lot, like there's similarities in thinking in the early stages of the Urbit project that don't exist anymore in that project at all, I believe. And it's similar to how Bitcoin forks, like what Bitcoin how Bitcoin kind of runs now as BTC with like trading and BlackRock ETFs and things doesn't really have anything to do with the early stages, right? But we've been coming along as a sort of later wave in the AI transition. And so we were kind of aware of some of this. And so we knew that, hey, this isn't going to fit into the framework that you normally have. But also we had this sort of understanding about network effects. And when you're building something that intrinsically is about the utility that you get from being able to not just like connect to a social network where you can interact with people and call them up. So it's not very useful if you have like a network of telephones with one telephone, right? I have a buddy with a satellite with a space technology company that is it's a similar sort of minded technology where it's a network effect where you really need hundreds of thousands of of nodes, and then you really get the on a single node basis, then you get a lot of utility, right? And this technology is very similar, where if you only have a small number of nodes, or if you only have if you're not over some minimum threshold of complexity, of like whether that's like connecting out there to a network, or if it's just like pure graph complexity. If you don't have enough complexity, then you kind of it's not, you don't have the problem that is being solved. But out there in the market, all of the ways in which people do things are currently below this communication complexity threshold. So anything that's actually valuable and worth solving, that's why you can have like Sam Altman go out there and be like, give me $7 trillion, because all of that $7 trillion that he's printing, that nobody is going to be able to go out there and the pace of that change is like getting more and more short term and real time and rapid, right? So these numbers are disappearing. But anyway, so the point that I was going to make is that 2128 as a technology, but also the way that we were designing and figuring out how to build and run companies off of the technology. The company that I was building here was really the first adopter of the architecture, as opposed to a traditional rationalist like startup. Hey, you're going to try to build the thing and then sell it to somebody else. There were no customers because everybody else is on the legacy, not just the legacy technology stack and the legacy information architecture, but they're on the legacy economy that has built up to centralize all of these like high complexity things. And as a proposition of Bitcoin, and of these distributed peer-to-peer networks, is that it doesn't make sense if you kind of just like add more fuel to the fire in the central core. And that's what Bitcoin is today. It doesn't necessarily mean that it's always going to be that way. So we sort of like after 4 years of sort of being like a pre-seed seed startup, we kind of had to like call it quits for a bit. Because there is no value to gain. It actually is a huge cost, and it was a huge amount of work for us to kind of like cope with maintaining a certain level of organization. And the challenge with that was that in the first 2 years of the company, when you're small and you have time and it's and you're learning as you go, we really needed to be in market, and everybody was losing their mind, and you couldn't go anywhere and everything. So I kind of had to twiddle my thumbs for a bit, and then we ended up doing a little bit too much research in the early days as well, and then we had to like figure out how we reconciled that. So sorry, that's a long answer, but basically the company was simultaneously too big and too small. But in the scope of the project, which I always think of as like a 2030 timeframe, by significantly reducing in size and therefore getting some longevity and getting some time to figure out what the strategy should be, we're now going from 2020 to 2024 Bitcoin halving sort of periods where we had these first 2 years and the second 2 years, and now we're going into like season 2, and so we have some sort of time to reorient everybody. People start new companies, There's other projects that are popping up that need our help. And so and the New Zealand operation like never needed to be this big, but it needed to be able to support the community and support the network. So I'm doing a bunch of work in sort of like hibernation mode to pack up all of the projects we did, have it be a lot more explainable. I have a big like IP backlog that I have to work through, but also like it frees up a bunch of people to not be tied in a tragedy of the commons to like just my company in New Zealand. They can go and start to make moves in other places as well. So if you think about when in 2020 and 2021, a bunch of people were leaving Tlon, and Logan was one of these first guys who went out there and started the first Urbit business. And then there were like, now there's like 10 of them or something, and people making hardware and doing all kinds of cool stuff. And there's a foundation. So I'm hoping that we'll be able to move away from like a Tlon development R&D sort of thing where, yes, we, doing the work, but we create a lot of problems too. Like sit at a nice baseline where we just exist. We ensure our longevity pretty well, and then we kind of start to operate in a little bit of a community mode. So we haven't like reopened that. I'm sort of like doing that project at the moment. But there's also a bunch of things that I wanted to be doing with like content in the community, and then like encouraging other people to start to not necessarily like develop on our tools, but start sort of parallel efforts. And you can see Zorp as one of these like really strong companies that has a capability that is beyond what you see in like the EAC AI world, but also beyond what you see in like the Ethereum crypto world, because those businesses have sort of like they've lagged behind the real economy. Yeah, so sorry, that's a long answer, but hopefully that sets the context pretty well for the rest of the chat.
That was great. That was a very Putin Tucker Carlson-esque answer. I like that. On the subject of the EAC guys and that whole kind of movement, there was recently a very entertaining stat where that was actually pretty one-sided on where they were mad at you for a reason that I'm not even entirely sure about, or they were mad at Goth, I think.
There's a whole like what you see is that like America itself is like a metaverse. It doesn't have a psychological capacity to like, it's what Nick Land calls the outside. They don't have any like outsideness. So Ardian he has this perfect quote, which is that EAC is just Nick Land diluted for LinkedIn. Right. Like so they're like Reid Hoffman accelerationism. And when there's like this outsideness that they get exposed to, that's actually like an info hazard to them. So we never set out to like have any problem. Honestly, like the Beth Jesus guy and like 2 years ago or whatever, while he would post some stupid stuff and I'd DM and be like, it's not that way. And he would just never reply. So but I don't have a problem with the guy. Like he's got like, from what it sounds like, he has some cool technology. It would be nice if he could understand what we were talking about, because the things that he says that he believes that he stands for is what we do stand for. And then the things that he claims that he sort of like pins on me is mostly just a projection of the struggles that he deals with. And I would not want to be, I chose to not put my company in Silicon Valley. I think it is a little bit harder in some ways, but you're not trapped in that establishment model. It's properly decentralized. And so I don't know. Those guys are sort of like, they're a few years behind. We've been doing this for a while. The 21.8 stuff sort of kicked off with Andrew DeSantis and pre-Bitcoin forks and having fun on Twitter and everything. And a lot of those EAC people, I think they're sort of like I was like that in 2014, 2015, 2016 sort of time frame, and it takes time to learn and understand how things work. But from what it sounds like, the thermodynamic computing stuff, basically, like, they're thinking the right way, but they're just trapped in the academia establishment, and they're trapped in the venture capital establishment. And so when they sort of talk about techno capital, they're really talking about Reid Hoffman, Mark Andreessen, world. Ardian says that's just cyborg theocracy. I agree. It's just like this, really one and the same. And so, but within the American like metaverse, Republican and Democrat are like real polar opposites. Whereas when you like step out of America, like it's just the American like computer internet media system. And the further away you get from that, the more you realize it has no impact on what you'd be doing somewhere else. So does it make sense? So we don't really have any beef with the EAC people, except for the fact that they're wasting their time. Like, if you're gonna when Chloe was like picking fights when it first, like when somebody picks a fight, you have to like, it started, right? So I was just saying, hey, it's a waste of time. Basically, you could make more if you're a real accelerationist, you could just firebomb San Francisco and everything would move faster. So it just triggers. But there's also an interesting thing, I think, culturally, because a lot of these EAC people are not actually Americans. They're actually Canadians who have been so burned by this like AI safety stuff and like Trudeau administration, and they're so close to they're in North America, so they're like a very strange cyborg hybrid of this sort of Church of England LGBT crazy AI safety and being in America, being in North America, and being tied into the American economy. So I think a lot of what's happening with EAC is that it's actually Canadians who are trying to kind of escape the MAID system, that like the system of government that's like the cyborg system of government that's running that, and they're so like trapped in the cult still. They're so tied up into the system that when they get a glimpse of the fact that who they think they are, it's all of this is identity crisis. So when they get a glimpse that they believe that they're fighting that system, but when there's other people out there who are saying, no, you're part of their system, it creates a crisis because you don't know who you are anymore, right? And what you kind of need to do in those situations is not like extend the thing. You kind of need to be very clear in black and white and be like, those are those people over here. There's like the satanic cult, and there's the church, and there's no real middle ground of like like Keynesianism is the middle ground, right? But there's just full Keynesianism is dead. Bretton Woods and everything is all dead. Like that model of the world is it last century. Right. Ardian says that like the 21st century only just started in June of 2020 when the Russians built that big church, because that was like the pronouncement that like we're actually in a different, it's the end of the 20th century. So the 20th century sort of like printed some money to hang on and like up until 2020, and then it's like, nah, boomers can't survive too much extra longer. We're clearly in a new century now, and when you look at things on a future orientation like that, which is very clear when like things like this Putin interview, where people are speaking to history, to future historians and things, not participating in like whatever the thing, and the contrast between Biden like not having any memory on the same day that interview out, I think was very. It's the exact proof of what's happening here, right? So this Keynesianism is dead, and it's sort of like this sort of like hybrid system that came from von Neumann in like World War II, which is all about, well, you got to manage the socialism and the capitalism sort of like backwards and forwards, right? And what sort of happened is that it's like it's just instability. Like you try to centrally and manage it for a certain time, and then you have like a Chernobyl event, right? And so all what you really have now is this like theocracy and monasteries pretty much on the other side, and one of them is the identity from the machine, the role and the identity and who you are and everything, and the non-binary from the machine, and then so you can choose to sort of like be a part of the machine, or you can choose to be a part of something that is bigger than that. When you start to have AI, it's really stark, because the machine is sort of like sucking up everything that has any tendency. So when you get something like EAC, it's a sign of the time dilation of US techno capital, which is that the time that it takes for that reality to actually hit San Francisco is a lot longer than it like how quickly the Bank of England blew up after Ethereum turned off their mining, and after it and FTX blew up, compared to how long it took for Silicon Valley Bank to have problems. And all of the, and it's like how they all like use pages and credit cards and all this kind of stuff. Like New Zealand was on cashless society in the 90s, with like free bank transfers between everybody. And then the Apple Pay is a regression towards paying transaction fees. We weren't even paying transaction fees for a long time. So there's this sort of like time dilation in techno capital, which is that the capital buys time for the technology transition to catch up. And that's how like the American system maintains its control. And so these effective accelerationists are really D-cells, because they're going like, no, don't go accelerate without me. Please wait for me, hold up, right? And we'll just be saying like, all that shit is like dead x86 von Neumann architecture shit, guys. Like, come on, like give it up and just come over here, right? And you can look at Logan as like an example of somebody who came through San Francisco, who came through all of that, like all of the teal and like Yavin shit and everything, and then he is Urbit. Like there is nobody actually, all of the capabilities and visions and everything that they had in that project was basically compromised because of these like real worlds, like San Francisco capital technology, real, like you need a product, and it's hard work. It's really hard work, and you don't make it easier by compromising on the principles. And so what is interesting with Logan is he is sort of like the product of the Urbit project. He is the guy who like was actually really sold on these base principles. Let's actually go, develop all this kind of stuff on top of it. And then what he saw was like, the people that he was trained up by, that he was, building and working on all those products and everything. He worked on projects that, but I think apparently there's been an Urbit iOS app that's been created and then canceled like 3 times over. And then in the end, he actually got that architecture and what he learned there, and focusing so much on that raw foundation and those principles, that ends up turning into, hey, actually, you don't need all this other shit, that complicated shit on top. You need this instruction set. That instruction set is the product, and there's missing pieces to actually extract the value from that. And 2018 was, I started up in late 2019, and I went to those guys when Logan was there and when everybody is in San Francisco before the COVID stuff happened. And I was saying like, hey, you guys should be, you actually have real technology here. It has real value. You should be thinking about building businesses that use this platform, because they were still like, dealing with all the NFT stuff and everything, trying to figure out how they keep their project going. That was like the state that we were in for the last 12 months. And I ended up basically being a little bit hard-nosed about we really need to stick to the principles. And if we can't also do all the VC type of stuff in this way and everything, then we have to massively, reassess the situation. But in a lot of projects, they end up going the other way, and they compromise on their principles, and then end up having a strange product that's kind of like doesn't really deliver anything because it doesn't have those. So what's interesting with Zorp is that I think that, obviously he's just focused on proving at the moment and then building some blockchain sort of stuff. And his project initially came out of like some work that he did with the Uqbar guys. And I think that he basically just took on the blockchain sort of like piece of that because it's a clear use case and it brings like clear value. But I think that probably he's going to be in a good position to pretty much over this next 4-year period, pretty much redevelop and out-deliver most of all of the tools and software and platforms and everything that goes on top of it. Because once you can have a proving infrastructure, you can trust that those principles aren't being compromised. You can't prove everything with a zero knowledge proof, but between zero knowledge proof and the proof of work systems that we're developing and what you have with Bitcoin, it looks pretty good compared to what exists today. I can't remember what the question was. Sorry.
I was trying to remember that myself right when you said that. The thing I wanted to ask immediately after that, though, you were talking about Biden and the obvious cognitive decline, and you were talking a little bit about cognitive security and not getting trapped up in memes. I don't know if you heard about this, but there was a report. The title of this report I'm looking at: Pentagon report predicts new age of COVID bioweapons and brain chip warfare. It's by Li Feng, and it literally details how this possibility within the next 5 years of octogenarian senators and congressmen having brain chips installed in their brains to retain cognitive capacity and be able to move around rather than just resign and let a younger person take over.
The PDF is the brain chip. Like when you read those, like that just made no fucking sense. The Pentagon and the bio and the it's just entertainment. So it's just like a bunch of scary words that the computer machine has put in front of you that get you to have an emotional response.
So you don't.
So like when I talk about psychological cognitive security, it's what your reaction is to reading those words on the Pentagon.gov website. Do you actually does .gov carry weight? Is it a real thing, and is it real? So when those things come out, is that reality or not? And what Bitcoin shows is that there's this thing called proof of work. So if you don't have weight behind your messages, then it's just garbage. Make sense?
It makes sense.
So what's interesting is that you can see how, so like the thing to do is like, obviously like nobody's afraid of Biden because he's like some geriatric walking around having ice cream. Elon Musk is more of a real like US statesman. He has more real power than Biden. But I also say that Elon Musk is like just AI Biden. He's just walking around like with an ice cream being like, maybe use AI for that. And that's where his power comes from, because it's all tied up in like the stock and the meme marketing and the brand marketing and everything, and what words they say about climate change, electric vehicles. And when you use these words, that means that people are paying attention to those words and the line is going up. You need like it's all about, when you see that a line is going up, but it has no crypto proof behind it, then it's just there. It's just there as a toy enigma that you're attributing 20th century meaning to, but it's like a zombie. It's like when you get these like when you look at the Land Rover Defender 2022 versus the Land Rover Defender in 40 years ago. Land Rover Defender 40 years ago is like proof of work. And now it's been inflated and diluted, and it's got all these soft edges and stuff. I saw a tweet the other day, like the Tesla, when you buy a Tesla, they don't even give you foot mats, floor mats. You have to buy an upgrade to actually get. So in reality, like what they sell is like fancy because they put a high ticket price on it, is just this like big complicated system of like the equity and finance and debt to cope with the unmanageability of all this complexity, right? And so what's happening when you see things like there's a thing on pentagon.gov that it says worry about the brain chips. Honestly, that's a self-referential thing where that's just the Pentagon exactly saying what they're worried about, and that they're already compromised from a cognitive security standpoint because they don't know how to deal with the reality of what a brain chip is or not, right?
Right.
And all information technology is all military technology to start off with, right? So if they're having a PDF on a web domain, that's like the brain chip complaining about the next gen brain chip. It's like Steve Jobs being paranoid about maybe this is a good example, is that like Steve Jobs would have never let the Vision Pro happen. And now there's probably people stressing about all these problems in the Vision Pro and being like, Steve Jobs would have never, let us get into the situation. How do we deal with all these problems, right? Which the Vision Pro like probably would be fucking up your head, right? Now the brain chip thing is literally just designed for people who have like motor neuron disorder. You don't need a brain chip because like why would they bother? Because it's like all the surgery costs and everything when you already have this like screen that goes straight into your eye, and the bandwidth of your eyes like interconnect is just so much bigger than like what they could squeeze through some tiny little like single core ARM chip with like some signal processing, right? Basically, it's just going to be the only thing that the brain chip is going to do, except for like people that have some like actual sensory thing where they actually need some help, is that it's just going to be the notification. It's just going to constantly be hardwired so that you can never turn your phone off, and it's just going to be pinging you whenever like some tweet came out. And all of us who are hyper addicted to Twitter, like we already have the brain chip. Like don't worry about some hypothetical scary brain chip that's just okay. If you're worried about it, just don't get it, right? But everybody bought iPhones, and everybody is like 16 hours screen time, and so cognitive security isn't about some hypothetical, and AI risk is the same thing. AI risk isn't about some hypothetical existential crisis thing. It's like, no, like remember when they AI generated a virus and AI generated a vaccine, and then like lots of people died and lots of people lost their minds? Yeah, that happened. So like, sorry, EAC people are like, I know that you want to get the like next Mark Andreessen money or whatever, but Mark Andreessen deleted the thing off his website where he was like, the vaccine saved the world. Because like, oh shit, like maybe don't ask me about that, and so AI systems are very advanced, have been around for everything. Our problem is that we're extremely dependent on them, and they don't work. They don't actually work. It's not intelligence. It's just like people found this compression algorithm toy. They built a big HPC data center and they just chucked all the data in it, and they saw what comes out when you like try to make a zip file of like 80 petabytes, and it gets to like 69% and the compression thing fails, and they don't have their files compressed, but they take out the model, and then when they sparkle new tokens into it, it generates text, and they're like, wow, it's magic. And people don't know how that stuff works underneath. Even Ilya, who was like the guy who most understood how the models worked and the fact that it was compression, he was having these interviews with Jensen where he was like starting to talk like, like a new age, some like new age, spiritual person, right? About like, wow, it's compression, without being able to rationalize, oh, what we're doing isn't intelligence. It's actually just predicting these patterns, and then those patterns are triggering a psychological response in us, similar to the one that we get when we interact with people. And what's interesting is that this technology, it's all since World War II. So our society has become more and more and more like the way our brains work has become more and more and more like constrained by how our computers and our systems work. So we don't have the ability to comprehend how things like happened. And like if you go on YouTube, you can find all these conspiracies about what's it called? Tartaria. And people are like, wow, these big cathedrals, they were wireless energy generators and power plants and everything, because the only analogy and understanding they have in their head is power. But they don't have the ability to they don't understand what a church was actually like for people when people were in there. And so they don't have a real notion, they don't have a word that means what the Holy Spirit meant. Whereas really it means it's like information and energy. Like God is information and energy. But now it's all compute, because our conceptual capacity is limited by our information systems. Our information systems can't comprehend that level of complexity. So you end up with simplifying everything down to, a computer, it's like a calculator. You can do your spreadsheets on it, right? But you can also generate doom. And people in the 80s really struggled. They were also trying to do artificial intelligence in the 80s, right? And that was because they couldn't comprehend what you could actually do with their computer, right? And so they put these systems onto it. And what's happened is that the technology has transitioned from the technology of Steve Jobs and Gates and Xerox and everybody that the boomers created last century. Now we're in new worlds where the only two technologies are language models because of social media and cryptocurrency and proof of work because of cryptocurrency. And those are the only two things that millennials and Zoomers understand experts at technically. So we have to fold every problem in the world through these two toolkits. What's interesting is that compute itself, the theory of compute, actually has advanced a lot. And so in those two realms, there is a lot of insight. But it needs to actually, right now, it needs to replace every part of the stack that is, and this is why Urbit was a good project. It's a terrible project as some Ethereum NFT thing with JavaScript because it doesn't deliver any of the values of a principled, purely functional operating system stack, right? Zorp is interesting because they're like, oh, okay, it looks like we need to revisit what we're doing and double down on that knock thing again. But the proposition of that is that, actually, then you can rebuild computing. You can port Windows and Mac and Linux and everything onto a new instruction set that has a level of integrity at the base level that you don't get when you're in the NVIDIA and Intel sort of lands. You have to worship TSMC, right? And so that's what people don't understand is that as an instruction set architecture that's purely functional, it's not like something like Urbit or something like Bitcoin script. They are not in the TSMC stack. They don't comply with that at all. So that's how you could have Bitmain and these other, Dragon Butterfly Labs and all these other companies that popped up out of nowhere in very short time frames. And the problem that unfortunately that has all been lost. So there's still people out there who really want to go and solve big problems and be really ambitious, but the barrier to entry has been lifted up. So now it's only Sam Altman and Microsoft and NVIDIA on the establishment on AI. And then the only crypto kind of things you can do are these stock investments that sort of financialize the AI framework on top, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I'm following you. And just to clarify, I wasn't particularly concerned about the chips. I found it funny that the Pentagon felt the need to say anything at all. Um,
Yeah, but what I mean is that the brain, the it's not about the physical brain chip. The
hmm,
idea of the brain chip is the brain chip. It is the brain worm that if you are like a based, like, right, like some based person online, if you're wasting your energy on complaining and being scared of the brain chips, then
hmm.
you're like controlled up. You're taken care of. They don't have to worry about you because you're spending all your time worrying about something that's fake. It's like worrying
Rocco's
about
brain chip.
it's literally a technology for disabled people.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like it's like being paranoid about wheelchairs, but the words that they use are scary
If
because
you're worried about it, you already have the
because you
mimetic fear.
correlate it with movies that they've fed you since you were a child about
Hmm.
big dystopian things, right?
Right.
But the technology that's real, the brain chip that's real, is the screen that you're reading that PDF through.
Hmm.
And what's happened is that what was previously, the real government and real system of security and everything of the Pentagon, they have been compromised. They are the cyborg brain chip where they are worried about those technologies
Hmm.
because of the insecurity of the dot, like the meaning that you attribute to .gov is the same as the meaning that you attribute to the dollar, right? And so it's a symbol, and that symbol, like Ardian says, like all symbols fall. So the Pentagon .gov website is, yes, it is what the Pentagon was, but what the Pentagon is not what the Pentagon was, if that makes sense. It's all crazy paradoxical. And the thing that you need to be able to do is be grounded in reality and go, what threat does some hypothetical chip that doesn't exist, what threat does that actually have on me as a person? And how do I classify the severity of that threat versus all of the other real threats that are in front of you that don't have the platform of being fed to you through the algorithm, right? So the other thing is that, like, it's just perfect. Like, there's no such thing as bad marketing,
Hmm.
right? So like, if the X.com Elon Musk algorithm is feeding you scary things about Pentagon brain chips, like they probably want you to see it because now you're thinking about brain chips and now like they have mind share. Make
I,
sense?
yeah.
So it's
Yeah.
all about tolerance, being able to resist these memes that much that it's amplifying some paranoia over a technology that's actually very benign.
Hmm.
And when that happens, you have to think about what are the real risks that they're making us scared about technology that is not really a real risk, because there are probably other risks out there that if you knew about them, then things would be really bad. And so real risks and real infrastructure and everything, that's all like, emergency whistle, like the entire American economy, like broke in 2008. So, but if people, if all of the real understanding about that versus just trying to keep people like believing in it so that you can manage transitions to like things that aren't broken,
Hmm.
um, the fallout from that would be much worse than the status quo. And so all of these like this the social media view of the world, like if anybody who was like paranoid about the World Economic Forum actually like went to Davos, they would just be like, this is the most boring set of people. These guys like they don't have like a single cell of like original thought in their brain, right? And they would not have this reaction that people have on the internet. And it's the same sort of thing. Like the Neuralink thing is like it doesn't make any sense. Like the iPhone is so much better, and people have been addicted to it for a long time. And almost the fact that it's so good at that is a creator of lots of other problems. But now that you have everyone, like stuck in the social media, internet, headspace, it's really hard to unravel yourself from that. I think the PM of the UK, who only lasted like a month and a half, she one of the things that happened was she refused to use a BlackBerry. She like demanded she use her iPhone, and so all of her text messages got hacked. And so there's no sort of like it doesn't make sense to be scared about people who like some politician person who really is just like they're just waiting in line for their moment of fame. They don't hold real power, but there's people who do hold real power, and what's mostly happening in the economy and the technology right now is that's much more of a burden. So there's lots of people who like they would love to have Elon Musk's wealth. Elon Musk doesn't seem like very concerned about his wealth. He seems concerned about big infrastructure risk issues, but he is limited in his capacity to only solve certain he's solving problems at a massive scale with where the technology needs to be established and tested and ready to go. And so it's like with the vaccines, like you kind of you're stuck with two bad choices, and you have no idea which one how something's going to play out, and you kind of just need to let things take care of themselves. So the interesting thing is that not the whole the establishment and the central all the financial centers and everything, they're still very small as a unit of the overall size of the whole economy. And so the real problem isn't in these like centralized World Economic Forum or Elon Musk or brain chips or whatever it is, or Sam Altman with the 7 trillion. The real problem is individual people's productivity. And this is a big thing for me. Like I'm sort of one of these like anti-Bitcoin Bitcoiners, or like anti-Bitcoiner Bitcoiners, which is that I believe that Bitcoin is not nearly big enough. It's not nearly valuable enough. It needs to be 100 to 1,000 times bigger. And people who are getting a little bit of money in dollar terms by holding on to it and then flogging it off when some bubble comes through, they are getting paid out. They're basically beneficiaries. They're just on the dole, and they sort of like just got in early with the free land or whatever, and then they just like take their money and leave, and they don't produce any value in the time that they did that. And that makes the problem much worse, because then for every dollar, like there's $1,000 of somebody else's like retirement investment coming in. Yep.
No, continue.
Yeah, so for every dollar that like you put in, if you get 1,000 out, then that's $1,000 of somebody else's money. And the problem is that then they get trapped in the same loop. So when we have these cycles, that new massive wave of capital and human capital energy that gets put into these ecosystems, they all get distracted onto monkey pictures. Whereas right, and the reason that they need to be distracted onto monkey pictures is so that they don't undermine the sovereignty of their own like country and nation and everything in which they're relying upon. And like Bitcoin just sits on top of the American internet pretty much, right? And it's yes, it is more fault tolerant, but Bitcoin doesn't have a GDP except for its like energy infrastructure. The only thing that it produces is this energy market stabilization, but it doesn't produce any the token of except for like this capacity of data integrity that obviously you can use the blockchain. It doesn't produce like there's nobody growing food. There's nobody manufacturing cars. There's nobody creating real products. There's no actual real growth. There's just this security of risk management where it's like, okay, at least things aren't as bad as they would be if we didn't have Bitcoin. But that's this very sort of like participation award kind of thing, where you could actually be producing things and having an economy built around it. And it's like that, how I was saying with Urbit, where like the moment that Urbit like linked up into Ethereum, it would just turned into JavaScript.
Do you think that there's any promise for Urbit outside of something like Zorp? I know that Zorp is the premier company at the moment, but any of its technology?
I think that Urbit is just the brainchild of Curtis Yarvin, and Curtis Yarvin ideology is dead. It is in the 2010s, sorry. Ukraine is the conclusion of the Curtis Yarvin project, and everybody's decided that was a terrible idea to put CEO in charge of the country.
Zelensky was a CEO of what?
Yeah, he's like the project of like Ukraine as a country now is like a corporation.
Interesting. I've never heard it described as that.
Well, I mean, it's like quite clear. It's being, they run like a tech company. But this is a little bit more ubiquitous. Like Elon is also like a example of, well, here's a CEO who's like sort of running everything. But and this comes back to what I was talking about around communication complexity. Like if you think that our society doesn't run very well or our politics is bad, then like you do not want to know like how stupid the internals of like corporations are. Right? So my view is that like you actually have to, like, the technology doesn't even exist anymore. What Urbit initially set out to do, I think there's good ideas there, but the value there was never any ability to capitalize on it. If you read the Wikipedia article for purely functional data structure, it says like, well, it means that you can do lazy evaluation and memorization, and they're just like nobody ever did that in Urbit. But also Urbit as Urbit's instruction set is sort of like if you had the Bitcoin network with only the scripting language. So there is an ability to get some value out of this like purely functional instruction set, and having a purely functional instruction set with a purely functional data structure, like you can get a lot of value from that. I think like Logan is going, hey, there's this value that's like worth a lot of money that the Urbit project to have like your personal computing like doesn't really have anything to do with. You could rebuild that on the Zorp like engine and deliver a lot of those values, but you have to be able to make it fast. And that was the thing that like Urbit was always slow and broken. So it's and on one side it's that technology which none of the address space holders care about, and the address space doesn't have any conceptually it has no relation to the principles of the instruction set. And Urbit kind of just became that brand and meme and logo with some complexity bolted onto it, which has gotten diluted. If it could bring back that complexity, then it could have a new life. But like Curtis Yarvin kind of ditched the project. They tried to distance themselves from it and become more accessible to like rainbow head people, and and then they after about a year of doing that, they realized that was a bad decision because nobody in that group like cared about what they were doing, and they went back to Bitcoin after that. But it still runs on Ethereum. Does it make sense? So, but Curtis Yarvin ideology is like the idea of Alex Palantir running the US, and Palantir he has enough of his own problems to deal with because his company has been, it's like a Microsoft Windows 2006 graph analytics tool. That he has enough problems like just keeping up with running that organization, and the types of problems that states are dealing with are much different. What is interesting is that some like smaller countries, I think that they are now in a situation where they don't have this bureaucracy burden of scale. So in the 20th century, you really wanted to be big, and I don't think that's the case anymore. It's a burden of scale to be a large country, because your administrative problems are just massive. The US in particular, in the existence of Bitcoin, its constitution doesn't have the same sort of effect, because the Bitcoin system is like it's a supranational system of, it's like the same sort of decentralized consensus and fault tolerance that you have between the states, but at a global level. And so until America, until you can reconcile the Bitcoin blockchain with the American Constitution, then America is going to sort of be stuck in this cyborg virtual state where it has to kind of distance itself from the rest of reality. Yeah. So, but there's been a stark transition from Curtis Yarvin thinking to Nick Land thinking, which is that, yeah, and Nick Land was sort of this guy that like started off as a Marxist, and then talking about all of this like machinations of capitalism, and then realized that that has actually a lot more in line with Christianity than what people currently look at as capitalism. And so when I sort of was earlier, when I was describing this like central Keynesianism thing, what people attribute to capitalism, like people who are complaining about capitalism, they are actually complaining about communism, because they're complaining about all of the dehumanizing aspects of the machinations of capital. It's just that we kind of went from the Soviet Union being the cyborg theocracy and America being the free market, to the moment that they went off the gold standard and then created this uplift of energy that then took out the Soviet Union. It was like a magic trick. That it was like applying Conway's law to the Cold War, that there was literally mutually assured destruction, which is that the moment that the Soviet Union collapsed, the US, the way that they destroyed them was that they destroyed their own system of capitalism, which is that they went off the gold standard. And since 1972, you've basically been in this like backwards reality where like history ended and when the Berlin Wall fell, and then everything has been playing backwards until you end up with the reversion of like the Bretton Woods system. And modern von Neumann architectures, von Neumann game theory, the atom bomb and Bretton Woods, they all come from the same, they all come from, this moment in World War II. And so what Bitcoin represents is like you had this guy, John Nash, at Princeton alongside von Neumann, who invented non-cooperative game theory, which showed this thing of a Nash equilibrium about how you actually move beyond the beyond zero-sum thinking. And the entire American, computer system is stuck in 1940s game theory. And what Bitcoin represents is John Nash 1950s game theory, and parallel systems and everything. And we're moving off of that, architecture and that system of the world. And as part of that, people who would say like climate change and all this sort of stuff is the end of the world. It's like the mutually assured destruction thing. It is the end of that reality that a lot of people had, and a lot of systems and everything were built up to and believing it. And the moment that the spell is broken, it is the end of the world in a large extent. And that's why a lot of these like climate modeling and things like that, because they're looking at the world through what goes into the government supercomputers. It is the reality. They are like they are telling you what they believe, right? And it's exactly the same thing as the Pentagon thing. So rather than getting like confused into it and thinking that, hey, there's a bunch of people in the background like programming the supercomputer to generate this propaganda, it's really just a bug. It's like the system is broken and it's spitting out bad data and bad results, but it's just a computer system. It doesn't know any better. Yeah.
Well, I don't know why we bothered to write out questions because we really should have just had you talk the entire time because this has been incredible. There is one thing that you mentioned, and I read this a little while ago that you wrote. You described you were talking about the nature of the Apple Vision Pro, and then you mentioned earlier in this interview that Steve Jobs would never have allowed it to be created. Can you talk a little bit about that? And can you also answer, because I read a long Twitter post that you wrote about it, where you made the argument that, or you said something along the lines of whether or not the Android phone is a stolen product, which is a reference to the giant lawsuit between Apple and Google that was about whether or not something like the iPhone can be like the design of that kind of smartphone can be copyrighted. Can you talk a little bit about both of those things?
There's like a thing somebody wrote like in the late 90s or something where they described Microsoft as Protestant and Apple as Catholic. And so what you had was that Apple centralized, or they invented this iPhone that overnight like destroyed the whole market. But they centralized all the control of that product. So they forced Android into existence because they didn't satisfy the demand for what they created. They restricted it. And you could say that this is like, Steve Jobs' real failing, and that I guess he was afraid, or he didn't have complete he didn't have enough like control over what he was doing. He's dependent on others or whatever. He ended up putting himself in a very precarious health situation because he didn't trust the experts, right? Now, probably he was right for not trusting the experts, as a lot of other people don't trust the experts at the moment. But the problem is that we kind of need expertise.
Yes.
Right. So the thing is that the iPhone and Apple products were always, they could only be the best by being an exception. So you always had to have like Apple created Microsoft too. Right. What people don't know is that Steve Jobs was, pushed out of Apple. He recreated the company. And the only reason that he could come back to Apple was because Bill Gates invested $150 million into Apple to bring them back with a deal to put Internet Explorer and Microsoft Office onto the Macintosh. So what ended up happening with the PC was that Bill Gates saved Apple.
I had no idea.
And that's because the market demand for having Apple as a competitor was so much bigger than what Apple was for themselves. And Steve Jobs, when he came back to Apple, and that like whole, it happened in an amazingly short amount of time. That he redid all the Macintosh. He brought in, it's like they built OS 10 at Next, right? So he built this other he rebuilt all of Apple. Apple as it exists today is Next. It's not Apple as it originally was. He got pushed out, and instead of giving up or whatever, he started another company and he rebuilt everything, and he did it in the right way. And by the way, the web was created on a Next station. So Steve Jobs also is essentially, it's like how Microsoft is now like with OpenAI, right? The next station was this machine that provided that, like Steve Jobs actually having that side quest actually gave Tim Berners-Lee the capacity and the technology at CERN to be able to create the web. And when Steve Jobs came back to Apple, it was in the time when the internet and the web was like taking off, and Bill Gates was like, we have to get into this internet web. This is like pre-cloud, but Microsoft were on track to becoming Amazon and Google, because they were going to build Microsoft Azure in like 2004, and they had like 98% market share with Windows XP and everything, and they got slammed down and wrecked and destroyed by the Department of Justice. And that created the capacity in the market. It created the space in the market, first of all, for Apple to not have any competition. So it's very much like the 1970 moment with the Soviet Union, that you have this immense explosion of wealth in a very short amount of time, because you just have the entire market for the taking right in front of you, right? But it was the destruction in the same way that was the destruction that only happened because they compromised on their values. The iPhone was this like notion of taking all of the prize without folding in like the real market. So they created a two-tier society. Does it make sense? So they go back to, it's like, think about, it's like Microsoft and Android and Google are Protestant, and Apple is this like central control figure, right? Now, obviously, when you then have Tim Cook as the Pope, then it kind of doesn't have the same effects, right? People aren't so much, but it still is the Church of Apple. But Bitcoin represents this other thing over here, right? Which is that you don't just have Protestantism, which is like, let's have Christianity, but the king is the Pope and he gets to like chop his wife's head off, right? It's like Christianity it's like Catholicism, but with divorce. And everything going on in society at the moment with like the flags is the Church of England. It's the same thing. And I made this after all the EAC thing happened. I made a tweet that was like, if you actually want to understand what happened with Jeff Bezos, it's really interesting. Really, actually, very interesting. Somebody should do like an anthropological study over like what happened there. I have a tweet that said he had a bad case of anti-disestablishmentarianism, which is the actual word for when you have somebody who is against the disestablishment of the Church of England. And we are the people who are for the disestablishment of the Church of England. And that is currently represented by all of these like contemporary dynamics. And this guy like came out of Google, right? And he was still believing, he would sort of like lost faith in academia because he could see that it was increasing power and he got burnt by that. But he still fundamentally like was a part of the church. He kind of moved from Canada to Silicon Valley. So you're a believer, right? And so when things come up and you think that you're moving against the establishment because the establishment is forking into these, it's responding to these demands, when you suddenly have people showing up saying that you're a part of it, then it creates an identity crisis, and it's just a purely natural phenomena reaction to like not to stand up for yourself and to believe what you believe in. If you're in a cult, like it's always like that, and it takes time to unravel and then figure things out. So Bitcoin as a system that cannot be subject. There was a Twitter account I saw that said Bitcoin is monetary orthodoxy. So it's much richer and it's much more difficult and it's much more important on this constant ritual. It doesn't have the dilution of the word, right, that you have with it. Because Ardian, that's why Ardian started Canonic, because it's about putting books on Bitcoin. Same idea as like 21E8 is like the AI version of Canonic. It's like there are going to be these AI types of, GPU and computer graphics and video games, and all these systems are going to exist. But you need to be able to rate limit the dilution of that so that the value that is there can be addressable and it can be robust and you can trust it. And it's not like some cryptocurrency that you hold it one day and then it just doesn't exist the next, right? Like when you put money in Bitcoin, you're pretty like, it's probably going to still be there and worth something in a few decades. And that capacity planning that it gives you is worth more than any amount of money in the world. And so when you think about an icon, and that's what it is, it's an icon of the Vision Pro. It's salvation that's being dropped down to the believers in the techno church. But what you see is that it is becoming more difficult. The cleanliness and the power and the simplicity and the scale that Apple had when they were under the church of Steve Jobs, and he stuck them to his principles, right? When you lost that and you brought in the CFO, they're now no longer Catholic. Makes sense? And so as a result of that, Apple is turning into a company that puts Disney and that puts rainbow flags and that does VR goggles, right? And Steve Jobs would have never done that. Steve Jobs was completely against gaming. He did not like gaming at all. And it kind of makes sense because you can't do the sort of simplicity and battery life and all these like kind of normal person things of like your calendar and your email and everything that he really cared about as like a San Franciscan, right? You can't do that if you are consuming infinite capacity of graphics, right? And you could look at maybe Siri was one of these things of the first sign of like around, like that happened, I think 2009, like one of the first things after the financial crisis. And so you started to see these like compromises of like propping up the stock. Apple streaming services, all their services, cloud business and everything is part of this too. And Tim Cook was the guy who was in charge of all that. And so Apple is extremely valuable because it compromised on its focus. It compromised on like its actual kind of principles and product vision beyond its responsibilities as a company. And now its responsibilities as a company are just responding to whatever the market is programming it to want. And that market infrastructure is completely disconnected. It's just one node in a global system now. And so you will only get one type of, that's why it was important that this company was not in the US. You could not have built this company in the US, right? And that's why like people who maybe have some similar ideas and that they really like would have wanted to be doing the same kind of thing that we're doing, they find themselves trapped because they're processing the rational logic of US dollar venture capital and IPOs and NASDAQs, as opposed to pure information and compute and then rationalizing things like Bitcoin, in contrast to irrationalizable things like OpenAI. OpenAI doesn't make any sense except for as a big ritual sacrifice church to like the god of AI and technology, right? And that's only possible because you can buy NVIDIA stock. And so in any rational point of view, like the NVIDIA stock looks like the most risky thing on the planet, but really it's not, because what people are buying is that the line is going up and the entire US economy is just like the S&P 500. NVIDIA is the S&P 500. So it's just the index fund of revenue that's coming from people who are buying H100s, so that you're not overly invested in like one particular guy with his H100s and he doesn't know what to do with them. But there's a very stark difference between what the value that gets generated and the price of an H100 and the technology stack around that versus what you get with a gaming chip. And they intentionally disable all those data center features on a gaming chip. Now, the other interesting thing here with just Apple is that Apple and NVIDIA ended up being stark enemies. So they're really two sides of the same coin. And part of the reason for that is that NVIDIA wrecked Apple over and over and over with the CUDA drivers. And so Apple ended up getting into the GPU business and becoming a competitor to NVIDIA, which now actually puts them in a very risky situation, NVIDIA. So NVIDIA is trying to become a lot more like TSMC. They're not just getting out of the gaming business, but they're actually getting out of the CUDA business too, because the AI models have sort of like they've empowered Apple to be able to do vision pros and gaming and graphics and artificial intelligence things that previously was NVIDIA's bread and butter. And people know that those the Apple Silicon is so I'm very pro Apple Silicon as like a platform because it's just against it's pro decentralization for now. But the Vision Pro is being sold to people who are buying Vision Pros are people who are building on H100s in the cloud. Versus Bitcoin. My sort of argument is that like people who hold Bitcoin should instead of buying $3,500 one Apple chip, buy 10 Mac Minis that don't have the screen thing on the front of it, right? Yeah. So we could probably spend like all day on this topic, but
Right.
hopefully it's probably interesting to the Urbit people.
No, this has been fascinating. We're getting close to the end of our time, but as you bring up the Mac Minis, my last question to you is: how is Braden's Mac Mini? Is it okay?
It's very happy. It's in its lane, moisturized. Yep. We turn them all upside down so you don't see the Apple logo. That's the important thing. Is that the Apple chip, the Apple Silicon, like very pro that, but it has a black circle on the bottom. So we just turn it upside down. Some of them have orb stickers printed on them. You may have seen pictures on the internet.
I'm trying to look at mine now. Oh yeah, you're right. It does have a black. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for doing this. This was great and honestly insane. This was an amazing interview. I appreciate you, Mark, for speaking to us.
Yeah, thank you, Mark.
It was fun. Yep. All right.